The axe hit the pine so hard the whole tree shuddered, and Wesley Dalton barely had time to yank the blade free before the green hand closed around the front of his linen shirt and slammed him backward into the trunk behind him. His skull cracked against the bark. Stars burst white across his vision. He got one blurry look at the woman looming over him in the thin morning light, green-skinned, dark-haired, yellow-eyed, and tall enough that he had to tilt his chin to find her face, and then her forearm pressed flat across his sternum with a force that could have been a fallen crossbeam. One arm, just the one. She was not even bracing herself. She pinned him there the way he might pin a note to a post, steady and utterly certain, as if it cost her absolutely nothing. He opened his mouth. She spoke first. "I have something to tell you," she said, her voice low and deliberate, the accent a heavy Ironvale orc cadence that rolled the consonants like stones turning in a river. "And you are going to listen before you say a single word, woodcutter, or I will make you listen. Do you understand me?" Wesley Dalton was 26 years old, broad-shouldered from 3 years of felling timber at the edge of the Ashfall Forest, and reasonably brave when the situation called for it. He was also, at this precise moment, pressed flat against a pine tree by a woman who looked like she ate trouble for breakfast and found it bland. "I understand you," he said. She held him there for one more breath, her amber eyes reading his face for any sign of a lie. Then she spoke again, and what she said was the last thing he had expected to hear on a cold morning in the Borderton timber runs. "In 3 days, there is a peace council at the Thorngate market, your alderman and my clan chief. They are going to announce an alliance marriage. Your kind gives their most eligible unmarried man to my clan. My clan gives their most eligible unmarried woman to yours." She paused. "They already chose. You are the man, I am the woman." He stared at her. The arm across his chest did not move. "I do not remember agreeing to anything," he said. "No," she said flatly. "Neither do I." She stepped back. The pressure across his chest vanished, and he had to stop himself from sagging. She was a full head taller than him and built like the forest itself, dense and unyielding and alive in a way that made the surrounding trees look like furniture. She wore fitted warrior's leathers the color of charcoal. The bodice laced tight from hip to collarbone with rawhide cord, the shoulders cut away to leave her arms bare in the cold morning air. 2 short iron blades rode at her thighs in worn but well-oiled scabbards, and the leather across her torso was worked with faint clan markings pressed into the hide. She had a jaw that could cut glass and a mouth that sat in a straight, unreadable line, and her black hair was braided back so tightly it looked like it had been threaded through iron rings. She was, Wesley thought, the most strikingly beautiful and completely terrifying person he had ever seen. He rubbed the back of his head where it had met the bark. "How do you know it is me?" he asked. "I was told the woodcutter north of Thorngate, young, no wife, no family contract." She glanced at his axe, which had fallen in the pine needles when she grabbed him. "You are the only one, unless you have competition I am not aware of." "I do not have competition," he said. "There is barely a settlement out here. It is just me and the charcoal pit and the timber piles." She nodded once as if this were a grim diagnosis. "Then it is you," she said. "And you are the woman they chose," he said. Something moved across her face, not quite pain, not quite anger, but something that lived in the house between the two. "I am Borgakh Fireblood," she said, as if the name itself were a wall she was building between herself and whatever came next. "Warband second of the Ironvale clan. Daughter of the blood chief Borgakh Fireblood. Yes, I am the woman." Wesley bent and picked up his axe. He set it handle first against the fallen log he had been working when she appeared out of the trees like a bad dream with excellent bone structure. He crossed his arms and looked at her. "They did not ask us," he said. "No. So why are you here 3 days before the council? Why come tell me at all? You could have just shown up at the market and I would have found out with everyone else." Borgakh was quiet for a moment. The pine trees dripped morning dew. A crow called somewhere deep in the ashfall canopy. She looked at him with those amber eyes and said, "Because I wanted to see what kind of man they were giving me. and because I wanted to know before I stood in front of both our peoples whether you were the kind of man who would look at me like I was a sentence handed down by a magistrate or a person." Wesley looked at her. "You are a person," he said simply. And something in her jaw shifted almost imperceptibly, not a softening exactly, but a minute reduction in the certainty with which she was holding herself rigid. It lasted only a second, and then her chin came back up and the wall was back. "Good," she said. "Then we will talk." They did not talk there in the timber run. She followed him back to his camp, which was a modest affair, a lean-to over a charcoal pit, a canvas awning stretched between two oaks, a fire ring, a workbench with a hatchet and a draw knife and a few folded drop cloths. He had a kettle going within 3 minutes and set 2 tin cups on the log he used as a bench, and she regarded the whole enterprise with an expression that suggested she was cataloging every detail and had not yet reached a verdict. She sat when he gestured to the log. She sat the way he imagined a sword sat in a scabbard, contained, but aware. "The alliance," she said, wrapping both hands around the tin cup when he filled it. Her hands were enormous compared to his, the knuckles slightly scarred, the nails cut short. "It is real. The peace between the Ironvale and the border settlements has been fraying for 2 years. A raid here, a burned field there, grievances stacked up on both sides. My father and your Alderman Crow believe a marriage between the clans will bind the agreement." "Bind it," Wesley repeated. "Like rope binds a post." "Yes," she said, "exactly like that. That is not really the kind of marriage I had in mind." She looked at him over the rim of her cup. "What kind did you have in mind?" He considered the question seriously. "The kind where both people want to be there." Her amber eyes held steady on him. "That is a luxury many people do not have." "I know," he said. "I am not naive about the world. I just want to say it plainly before anything else. If we are going to talk honestly, let us start there." Borgakh drank her tea. It was plain bark tea, the cheap kind, and she did not complain about it. "You are direct," she said. "I do not know how to be anything else," he said. "I have been out here on my own for 3 years. There is no one to be indirect with. You just say the thing." She set the cup down on her knee and looked at the fire between them. "Then I will say the thing. My father is not wrong that this peace is crumbling. The border settlers push further into our hunting runs every season. Our young warriors take trophies from your supply wagons. People on both sides are going to die if it escalates. I know this." She paused. "I also know that being traded like a side of salt beef is not what I envisioned for my life." "No," Wesley said quietly, "I imagine not. But I am my father's daughter," she continued, "and I understand duty." She looked up from the fire and found his eyes. "What I came to find out is whether the man they chose is someone I can at least trust. Not love, I am not that foolish, but trust." Wesley thought about that for a moment. He thought about Alderman Crow, who had mentioned vaguely that some sort of formal arrangement was being discussed, but had been as slippery as spring ice about the details. He thought about his empty camp and his charcoal pits and his timber contracts, and the fact that nobody in Thorngate ever really talked to him except to pay for wood or complain that the splits were too thin. "Can I tell you something honest?" he said. "That is what I came here for," she said. "I have been alone out here for 3 years," he said. "Not just without a wife, just alone. My parents are gone. I have got work contracts and a few men I drink with at the Thorngate Tavern 3 times a year. But I am mostly alone, and I have made peace with that, so I am not going to pretend the idea of this arrangement is something terrible. If it is done honestly and both people are decent to each other, there are worse things in this world." Borgakh Fireblood stared at him for a long time. Then she said, "That is either the saddest thing I have heard all year or the most honest." "Probably both," he said, and the corner of her mouth, just the very corner, moved. It was not a smile, not yet. But it was the ghost of a smile's great-grandmother, and Wesley saw it, and he decided not to say anything about it in case it frightened her. They talked for 2 hours, there by the charcoal fire in the morning light. She told him about the Ironvale clan, their territory in the stone valleys north of the Ashfall Forest, their iron-smelting tradition, the complicated politics of a warband second who was also the chief's daughter. He told her about Thorngate and the timber trade, and the way the border market worked, where human coin and orc iron changed hands 3 times a week, and both sides tried very hard to pretend they did not need each other. When she finally stood to leave, she picked up her cup, drank the last half-inch of cold tea, and set it back on the log with a precise click. "I will see you in 3 days at Thorngate," she said. 3 days, he agreed. She was 3 steps into the tree line when she stopped. She did not turn around. "Wesley Dalton," she said, testing the name in her mouth like she was weighing a coin. "Yes," he said. "I am glad it is you," she said. And then she was gone between the pines, and the forest swallowed her like she was made of it. Wesley sat by his fire for a long time after that. He was not entirely sure what had just happened to his life, but for the first time in 3 years, the camp did not feel quite so quiet. The Thorngate border market ran 3 times a week along a wide, hard-packed strip of ground where the Ashfall Forest road met the northern wagon trail. It was not a pretty place. The stalls were rough timber and canvas and old wagon boards, and it smelled of sawdust and smoked meat and the sharp bite of new-worked iron. Humans came from the south and east. Orc traders came down from the stone valleys with bundles of raw iron ore and finished blades and smoked game, and they passed human coin back and forth with the careful, performative neutrality of people who did not entirely trust each other, but needed each other too much to say so. Wesley arrived at dawn on the 3rd day with a cartload of split timber because he had no intention of standing around the market looking useless while everyone stared at him. He sold half the cart by mid-morning and was in the middle of arguing good-naturedly about split quality with a mason named Derek Home when the mood of the market shifted. He felt it before he heard it, that particular silence that moved through a crowd like a tide pulling back before a wave. He looked up from the timber and saw the Ironvale delegation coming up the northern road. There were a dozen of them, all warriors in traveling leathers, big and broad and greenish-gray in the morning sun, and they moved with the measured unhurry of people who had been judged all their lives and had decided to take that energy and fold it into something impenetrable. Alderman Crow was already at the market center with 2 of the settlement's council members, and he was wearing his good coat, which meant this was formal. Borgakh walked at the front of the delegation, 2 steps ahead of the others, because of course she did. She wore the same charcoal leather she had worn in the timber run, laced tight from hip to throat, and she was looking straight ahead with the expression of someone who had prepared themselves for a room they did not want to enter. She carried herself like a drawn blade, perfectly controlled and ready for anything. Wesley abandoned his timber cart, told Derek Home he would be back, and made his way to the market center. Alderman Crow saw him coming, and his expression twitched between relief and guilt. He was a compact, clever man who ran the border settlements with a pragmatist's logic and had the unfortunate habit of making decisions about people the way he made decisions about timber supply efficiently, with the needs of the many firmly outweighing the preferences of the individual. "Dalton," he said, "good that you are here." "You could have told me directly," Wesley said, keeping his voice level. "I was going to tell you today," Crow said. "You were going to tell me in front of the whole market," Wesley said. "On the day itself, that is not the same thing as telling me." Crow opened his mouth and then closed it because there was no good answer to that and he knew it. The Ironvale war chief came forward. He was a massive man. Borgakh had her height from him, and her jaw, though his face carried 30 more years and a number of old scars. His name was Borgakh Fireblood, and he moved through the crowd with the kind of absolute self-possession that came from decades of being the most dangerous person in any given space. He stopped in front of Wesley and looked him over. It was not an unkind look. It was the careful, weighing gaze of a man assessing what he was leaving his daughter with. Wesley met his eyes. He did not look away. Borgakh grunted once, which in retrospect was probably the highest available mark. The formal announcement was exactly as awkward as Wesley had expected. Crow made a speech about peace and shared borders and the common interest of both peoples. Borgakh made a speech in the Orcish trade tongue that one of his men translated, about duty and alliance, and the iron that binds. A market full of humans and orcs stood in an uneasy ring around the proceedings, some watchful, some hostile, most just quietly fascinated the way people are by any spectacle they did not pay to see. When Crow said Wesley Dalton's name, the human side of the crowd made a mixed sound, some sympathetic, a few contemptuous. When Borgakh said Borgakh's name, the orc side of the crowd was silent in the particular way that meant something important was happening. Borgakh stood beside Wesley in front of both crowds and looked straight ahead. Her shoulder was 2 inches from his, and he could feel the warmth coming off her in the cool market air. He turned his head and looked at her profile, the strong jaw, the small tusk that showed at her lower lip, the precise braid, and he said, very quietly so only she could hear him, "Are you all right?" She turned and met his eyes for a brief, unguarded second, and what he saw there was not fear but something rawer, something like the face a person makes when they are being brave about something that is actually very difficult. "Yes," she said, equally quietly. "Me too," he said, which was a lie, and they both knew it, and somehow that made it better. The terms of the alliance were read out by Crow's scribe. 3 years of formal peace, open trading rights on the Northern Road, shared access to the Ashfall timber runs for Orc clan use, and the marriage between Wesley Dalton of the Thorngate settlements and Borgakh Fireblood of the Ironvale clan to stand as the binding seal of the agreement. The formal binding ceremony would take place at a joint council in 1 month's time, giving both parties time to prepare. After it was over and the crowd began to disperse with the particular energy of people who needed to go process what they had just witnessed, Borgakh took his daughter aside and spoke to her in low, fast Orcish for several minutes. Wesley stood nearby with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at his boots and tried to look like he was not listening to a conversation he could not understand anyway. When the war chief was done, he put one enormous hand briefly on Borgakh's shoulder, not tenderly exactly, but not without feeling, and then turned and rejoined his delegation. Borgakh walked back to Wesley. "He told me to be worthy of the alliance," she said. "Is that all?" A pause. "He told me." The man's eyes were steady, she said. "He did not say it was a compliment, but from my father steady eyes is a compliment." "I will take it," Wesley said. She almost smiled again. He was beginning to think of it as her signature move, the almost smile, like she kept the real one locked up somewhere safe and let the shadow of it out for air occasionally. "I need to spend the next month in the valley with my clan," she said. "Final preparations and goodbyes. Will you come?" He looked at her. "You are inviting me to your clan's territory. If we are going to do this," she said, "you should see what you are allying with, not just at a market in neutral ground. You should see the valley, the smelting fires, the people, my people." She paused. "And I should see your camp and your timber runs. We should know each other's worlds before we stand in front of both councils and make promises." It was, he thought, one of the most practically sensible things anyone had ever said to him. It was also extremely brave, inviting a stranger into her world before anything was settled, and he understood that the bravery was hidden inside the practicality on purpose. "I will need 2 days to secure my timber contracts and arrange someone to watch the charcoal pit," he said. "Then I will come." She gave him a single, decisive nod. 2 days, she said. Then she turned and walked north up the Ironvale road, and he watched her go, and the market carried on around him as if the entire world had not just quietly pivoted. He went to the Ironvale Valley. It was a 4-hour ride up a stone road that wound through the Ashfall Forest's northern edge, and then climbed into the gray-green hills where the trees thinned, and the rock came through the ground like bones through skin. The valley opened up beneath him when he crested the last ridge, and he pulled his horse up just to take it in for a moment. A wide, slate-bottomed river, a spread of hide tents and stone longhouses, smelting forges burning orange in the late afternoon light. The smell of metal and smoke and wood fire carried up the hill on a cold wind. It was alive in the way his timber camp was not. Noisy and purposeful and communal, full of people doing things and calling to each other and moving between tasks. Children ran between the long houses. A smith pounded at a blade on a portable anvil. Two young warriors sparred with wooden practice spears in a cleared space near the river, watched by a cluster of older men who were pretending not to care about the outcome but clearly did. Borgakh met him at the valley entrance as if she had been watching the ridge road. Probably she had. She held his horse's bridle while he dismounted and handed it off to a young man who took the reins with professional efficiency. "You came," she said. "I said I would," he replied. The look she gave him was brief but full of something, not quite surprise, but the adjustment a person makes when they have been disappointed often enough that the absence of disappointment feels notable. "Come," she said. "I will show you." She showed him the valley for the better part of 3 days. The smelting operation, which was older and more sophisticated than he had realized. The Ironvale clan had been working iron in these hills for generations, and their knowledge of metallurgy was embedded in the work, and the tools, and the names of the forge fires themselves. She showed him the long house where the clan's elders gathered, the river fishing stations, the curing racks where meat was dried for winter. She introduced him to people with the clipped, no-nonsense efficiency of someone completing a necessary task, but she watched his face during every introduction, cataloging how he responded. He responded with courtesy and genuine interest, because that was who he was. He asked the smith about the iron-working technique. He complimented a woman on the cured game she was preparing, and learned her name was Gretka, and she had been feeding the clan for 20 years. He watched the sparring practice and clapped when the faster of the two fighters disarmed the other with a neat foot sweep. Borgakh walked beside him through all of it with the quiet containment she carried everywhere, and on the second evening they sat together outside the long house she had been assigned for the pre-marriage preparations, and the valley fires burned in the distance, and the stars came out cold and bright above the hills. "You are not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "A frightened man doing his duty," she said. "Someone who would nod at everything and try very hard not to make eye contact with anyone and be relieved when it was over." "I was frightened," he said. "I still am a bit. I just do not think fear is a reason not to look at things directly." She looked at him. The firelight was warm on the green of her skin and picked out the amber of her eyes and softened the strict line of her jaw. She was magnificent, he thought, in the way that wildfire was magnificent, dangerous, and beautiful and beyond any one person's reckoning. "Why are you alone?" she asked. 3 years in that camp. No family contract. You are not ugly and you are clearly not a fool. Why has no one taken you?" It was such a direct question that it knocked the air out of him for a second. He considered giving a light answer and then decided she had earned a real one. "I think," he said slowly, "that I am too straightforward for most people. I say what I mean and I mean what I say, and I do not play the games that courtship usually requires. I make people uncomfortable with it. They want a man who will perform a little, be a little mysterious, be a little better at pretending. I just am what I am, and out here in the timber runs that is fine. The trees do not care." Borgakh was quiet for a moment. "In orc courting," she said finally, "there is no performance. You go to the person and you say, 'I want you.' That is the beginning. Everything after that is proof." "That sounds much simpler," he said. "It is terrifying," she said flatly, "which is the same thing." He laughed. A real laugh, surprised out of him, and she looked at him when he laughed, looked at him the way you look at something that caught you off guard and turned out to be wonderful. She did not laugh, but she watched him laugh, and something in her face was softer than it had been before. That was the night things shifted. They talked until the valley fires burned low, about everything and nothing. His childhood in the South before his parents died and left him the timber contract and the camp. Her years learning the warband craft from her father. The first time she had led a raid and come back with nothing but a twisted ankle and an injury to her pride. The way the Ashfall Forest sounded at night in deep winter, when the snow was thick enough to muffle every sound except the occasional groan of an ice-loaded branch. They talked the way people talk when they are not trying to impress each other, when they are just filling up the space between two people with something real. And somewhere around the second hour, Wesley realized he was happier sitting on a log outside a stone longhouse in an Orc clan valley in the hills than he had been anywhere in years. He went back to his camp and she stayed in the valley, and they agreed to meet at the Thorngate market 4 days before the binding ceremony, so he could show her his world the way she had shown him hers. She arrived at his camp before he was even fully awake on the first morning, standing outside the canvas awning with her arms crossed and her braid immaculate, and an expression that suggested she had been there for some time. He showed her the timber runs, the pine stands he had been working, and the oak grove to the east that he was saving for ship timber, the charcoal pit with its careful stacking, the way you assessed a tree's soundness before committing the axe. She watched everything with complete focus, and when he handed her the axe on impulse and gestured at a fallen birch that needed splitting, she took it with a look that said she knew what he was doing. She split the birch with 6 strokes, clean, economical, accurate. Each split was perfect. "You have done that before," he said. "Ironvale spends a season in the lowland timber runs for construction wood," she said, handing the axe back. "Every clan member works. I am not just a war blade." "I never thought you were," he said. She looked at him. "Most people do," she said. They spent 4 days like that, moving between his camp and the Thorngate market, and on the 3rd evening he made a fire and cooked 2 trout he had caught in the creek that afternoon, and she sat across from him and ate without ceremony, and told him about the time she had tracked a wounded boar through the hills for 3 days, because clan law said you did not leave a wound like that unfinished. And by the time she caught it, she was so tired she fell asleep leaning against the dead animal and woke up with snow in her braid. He told her about the winter his charcoal pit collapsed and he had to spend 4 days digging it out alone in the mud because there was no one else, and the contract deadline was still coming regardless of what the mud thought about it. "You should have asked for help," she said. "I did not know who to ask," he said simply. She looked at him across the fire for a long time. Then she reached over and put one hand flat on the log beside his, not touching exactly, but close enough that he could feel the warmth of it. It was not a romantic gesture. It was something simpler and more profound, a companionship gesture, the kind that said, "I see you and I am here, and you do not have to be alone in the mud anymore." He looked at her hand beside his. "Thank you," he said, though he was not entirely sure what for. She took her hand back and said nothing, and they watched the fire, and the Ashfall Forest settled around them in the dark. 2 days before the binding ceremony was when everything went violently wrong. Wesley had gone into Thorngate to collect the last of his formal clothing from the tailor, not fancy, but presentable, a new linen shirt and decent trousers, and to settle his timber contracts for the season. He was coming out of the contract office when he saw the 3 men in the street. He recognized 2 of them. Harwick Creel and his cousin Bors were the kind of men who ran the rougher edges of the border settlements, not outlaws exactly, but close enough to smell it. They had a 3rd man with them Wesley did not know, and all 3 of them were looking at something at the end of the street with expressions that made his stomach clench. He looked where they were looking. Borgakh was at the iron trader's stall at the market end of the street. She had come down from the valley to handle some last clan business before the ceremony, and she was standing at the stall with one of Urgamach's men looking at a set of finished iron brackets. She did not know about Harwick Creel and Bors. She had her back 3/4 to them. Wesley heard Bors say very clearly, "There she is. The one they are marrying to Dalton. Not the whole Orc is getting the deal, though. Just whatever that iron she is carrying is worth." And Harwick said just as clearly, "She is alone except for the old one. This is the moment." Wesley did not stop to think. He was across the street in 6 strides, putting himself between the 3 men and the iron trader's stall, and when Harwick Creel looked up and saw him standing there, The man's expression moved from calculation to cold irritation. "Dalton," Harwick said, "move along." "I will not," Wesley said. He could hear the market behind him going quiet, that same tide-pulling back silence he had felt at the announcement. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Borgakh turn at the change in the crowd's energy, saw her read the scene in about 2 seconds, saw her hand go to one of the iron blades at her thigh. "Do not draw it," Wesley said to her, not looking away from Harwick. "Not yet. Stay there." Borgakh's hand did not move from the blade, but she did not draw it. "You are going to back away from this stall," Wesley said to Harwick, keeping his voice at a volume the whole street could hear. "You are going to do it right now, in front of everyone here, and you are going to walk to the other end of the market. The lady is here on legitimate clan business, and she has every right to be here under the Thorngate border compact. If you do not back away, I am going to go directly to Alderman Crow and tell him that 2 men attempted to disrupt a sworn alliance negotiation, which is a hanging offense under the border charter, and I will name you both by name to the magistrate." The silence in the market was absolute. Harwick Creel stared at him. Bors stared at him. The third man looked between them and then looked at Borgakh and then seemed to do some rapid private arithmetic about the iron blade, the woman's size, the crowd, and his own immediate future. "She is an orc," Harwick said, but the certainty was already out of his voice. "Yes," Wesley said, "and she is my betrothed, and she is on treaty ground, and you are in violation of the border compact. That is all the law there is here today." Harwick held his ground for one more burning second. Then he turned and walked away, and Bors went with him, and the third man drifted after them like smoke after a fire. The market exhaled. Wesley turned around. Borgakh was standing 2 feet behind him. She had moved up while he was speaking without making a sound, and she was looking at him with an expression he had never seen on her face. Her hand was still on the blade hilt. She had been ready. If Harwick had moved wrong, she would have been in front of him before he could blink. "The border charter does not actually make that a hanging offense," she said. "I know," he said. "They do not know that," she said. "I know," he said again. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she removed her hand from the blade with deliberate care, as if she was making a conscious decision about what to do with the energy in her body, and she said, "That was well done, Wesley Dalton." It was the first time she had used his full name like that, not as a test the way she had in the timber run, as something she was holding carefully. "You did not need saving," he said. "I know that, you had it handled." "Yes," she said. "But you did not wait to find out." She paused. "You stood between me and the trouble." "You are mine to stand between," he said, and then caught himself. "Or you will be, if you want that, if the choice is yours." She looked at him, and her amber eyes were very steady and very warm. "In 2 days," she said quietly, "the choice will be ours." The binding ceremony was set for the morning of the council day, at the center of the Thorngate market where both delegations would witness it. The evening before, Wesley could not sleep. He lay in his camp with the charcoal pit's residual heat warming the air around him and the stars overhead through the canvas gap, and thought about the last month. The timber run, the tea, the valley, the fires at night, the trout by the creek, the story about the boar and the snow. He thought about her hand on the log beside his. He got up just before midnight and walked into the Ashfall Forest. Not far, just enough to hear the trees. He had a habit of that when he could not sleep, walking into the dark between the pines until his mind slowed down and he could think clearly. He had been standing in the dark for maybe 10 minutes when he heard footsteps in the pine needles, and then a familiar silhouette appeared between the trees. Borgakh Fireblood, unable to sleep also, had apparently had the same idea. They stood 5 feet apart in the dark between the pines, and looked at each other with the quality of 2 people who have both arrived somewhere unexpected and discovered the other person already there. "You cannot sleep either," he said. "No," she said. She came closer and stopped a foot away from him, and they stood in the dark among the pine trees in the silence, and he could see the faint amber of her eyes in the starlight filtering down through the canopy. "I want to tell you something," she said. Her voice was different in the dark, quieter, stripped of the careful architecture she normally carried it in. "Tell me," he said. "I did not want this," she said. "When my father told me, I was furious. I went to your timber run to see if you were someone I could hate, because that would have been easier. If you had been frightened of me or contemptuous or weak in the way some men are weak, self-important, and hollow, I could have done this as a duty and hated every day of it. But," he said, "but you looked at me like I was a person," she said, "and you made me tea, and you said I was yours to stand between." She paused. "And I have been awake every night since the timber run thinking about you, and I did not expect that. I did not plan for that. I do not know what to do with it." The forest was very quiet around them. The cold air moved slowly between the pines. "I think," Wesley said carefully, "that what you do with it is tell the person." "I am telling the person," she said. "Then I should tell you something back," he said. She waited. "I have been alone for 3 years," he said, "and I thought I had made peace with it. And then you pinned me to that tree with one arm and told me my life was about to change, and something in my chest shifted, and it has not shifted back. And every day since then I have been thinking that the thing I was afraid to want, which is someone, might be standing right in front of me, and I am terrified of being wrong about that." The forest breathed around them. Borgakh closed the last foot of distance between them in one step, and her hand came up and cupped the side of his jaw, and she kissed him in the dark between the pines. And it was nothing like the careful, negotiated kiss he might have imagined. It was direct and warm and absolutely unambiguous. The way everything about her was direct and warm and unambiguous. And he put his hand over hers where it held his jaw and kissed her back with everything he had. When they broke apart, her forehead was against his, and her breath was warm on his face, and her thumb was tracing along his jaw like she was making sure he was real. "I want you," she said, simply. The way she had told him was the Orc way. "I want you, and I choose you, and I am not doing this for the Alliance or my father or the peace. I am doing this for me. I want you," he said back, because it was true and it was simple, and it was the only honest thing to say. They stood there in the dark for a long time, her forehead on his hands wrapped around hers, the pine trees enormous and quiet around them. Eventually she pulled back, and he could see the amber glow of her eyes and the shadow of what might have been the real smile, the one she kept locked up, and it was. "Go sleep," she said. "Tomorrow you have to stand in front of both our peoples and look dignified." "I will try my best," he said. "You are terrible at dignified," she said, and there was the smile again, full and unguarded and extraordinary. "You have only known me a month," he said. "I know," she said. "I am already an expert." He walked back to his camp smiling in the dark, and this time sleep came easily. The morning of the binding ceremony was cold and bright, the kind of autumn morning that had teeth in the air but gave you that low, golden light in exchange for the discomfort. The Thorngate market was packed. Both delegations had arrived by dawn. The Ironvale clan in their traveling leathers with the clan marks on their shoulders. The Thorngate settlement people in their good coats and uncomfortable shoes. Alderman Crow stood at the center of the market in his finest, trying to look statesmanlike and mostly succeeding. Borgakh Fireblood stood opposite him, and the war chief looked neither nervous nor festive. He looked like a man attending to serious business, which Wesley respected. The ceremony itself was a blend of both customs, which Crow and Borgakh had apparently spent several evenings negotiating. There was a human exchange of spoken vows, and an orc binding rite that involved a cord of braided iron wire, looped loosely around both their right wrists, and then ceremonially knotted. The cord was orc-made. Iron wire worked smooth and thin enough to wear without discomfort, and when Borgakh tied the knot, her fingers were steady and precise. Wesley's fingers were not entirely steady when he spoke his vows. He noticed it and decided not to be embarrassed about it. He said the words clearly and meant everyone, and when Borgakh said hers in the trade tongue so both crowds could understand them, her voice was level and unhurried, and filled with a quiet certainty that made something in his chest lock into place like a beam settling into its notch. Borgakh came forward and clasped his hand both hands, in the orc formal style, and held them briefly and said something in Orcish that one of the young translators rendered as, "You are Ironvale now in the way that matters." Crow clapped him on the shoulder and said, "Good man, Dalton," which was the highest form of praise Crow's emotional vocabulary allowed. Borgakh, now beside him, leaned down slightly, she had a solid half head on him, and said in his ear, "You nearly dropped the cord." "I was nervous," he said. "So was I," she said. "I hit it better." "You always do," he said. She turned her head and looked at him from 3 inches away, and her amber eyes were warm and a little wild and entirely, completely present. "Not for much longer," she said. They had assumed, in the abstract negotiations of the month before, that they would figure out the matter of where they would live after the ceremony, whether that meant his camp, or the Ironvale Valley, or somewhere between the two. What they had not anticipated was that the question would be resolved for them, badly, 3 days after the binding ceremony, when word came up the northern road that a man named Gareth Sund had lodged a formal dispute with the border magistrate, claiming that the alliance marriage was invalid under border law, because the settlement's written charter required any land use agreement affecting the timber runs to be approved by a majority vote of landholders. And Crow had not held that vote before the ceremony. Gareth Sund was a large landowner on the eastern border who had been trying to get his hands on the Ashfall northern timber runs for 2 years. The alliance, which gave the Ironvale clan legitimate timber access in exchange for peace, cut him out completely. He was, in short, the kind of man who used legal instruments the way other men used clubs. The dispute landed like a stone in a still pond. If the magistrate ruled in Sund's favor, the alliance agreement was void, which meant the binding ceremony was void, which meant the peace deal collapsed. If the peace deal collapsed, the Ironvale clan was within its treaty rights to resume raiding the northern road, and the past 3 years of grievances would light up like a powder keg. Wesley found out when Crow sent a rider to the timber camp at dawn, and he was on horseback heading for Thorngate before the rider had finished explaining. He met Borgakh on the road. She had heard from a clan rider and was coming from the north, and they pulled up in the middle of the road and looked at each other across 5 feet of packed dirt. "Sund," she said. "Yes," he said. "Your laws are complicated," she said. "In the clan, if someone challenges a binding, we challenge them in return on the field, and whichever of us is still standing wins the argument. I find that increasingly sensible," he said. "We cannot do that," she said, with the slight weariness of someone who has had this exact thought and already argued themselves out of it. "No," he agreed. "We do what we can with what the law gives us. Crow needs to call the landholder vote today and win it. If he can get the majority, the dispute collapses." "Can he?" she asked. Wesley thought about the Thorngate landholders, the farmers, the traders, the mill owners. He thought about who needed the peace more than they feared the orcs. He thought about Derek Home, the mason, who bought half his timber supply and had been trading iron brackets with the Ironvale clan for 2 years. He thought about the ferry keeper at the Ashfall crossing who moved goods between the Valley Road and the Southern Market, and whose entire business model relied on both sides not killing each other. "He can," Wesley said, "but he needs to move fast, and I need to help him make the case." They went to Thorngate together, riding side by side up the market road, and when they arrived they found Crow already pale and frantic in the market square with his counsel, and Gareth Sund's legal man standing on the other side of the square with a self-satisfied expression and a sheaf of papers. Wesley dismounted and walked directly to Crow. "Call the vote," he said. "Right now, in the square. Get every landholder you can find in the next 2 hours and call it." "If we lose the vote," Crow started. "We will not lose it," Wesley said. "I know these people. I have been selling them timber and buying their iron and eating in their taverns for 3 years. Let me talk to them." He spent 2 hours going from stall to stall and door to door across Thorngate, making the case as simply and directly as he knew how. He told the ferry keeper what peace was worth in coin per year. He told the mill owner what the Ironvale iron supply had saved him in import costs. He told the farmers on the eastern edge what raids would mean for their harvest season. He was not eloquent and he was not political, but he was honest and specific, and he knew every person he talked to by name, and it turned out that mattered enormously. Borgakh did not follow him on this circuit. She stayed in the market square with her clan members and let him work, which he understood. An orc warrior making the argument for the orc alliance would have undermined the argument. She sat on a wagon tongue in the market square with her arms crossed and her iron blades at her thighs and watched the market with those amber eyes. And every Thorngate citizen who passed through the square and saw her there calm and patient and simply present, made some private calculation about what kind of people the Ironvale were, and what kind of woman had come to bind the peace. The vote was called at midday in the market square. 14 landholders eligible under the charter. 9 needed for a majority. 11 voted for the alliance. Gareth's son's legal man looked at the result for a long moment, folded his papers with precise, angry care, and left without speaking. Crow let out a long breath that he had probably been holding since dawn. Wesley walked back to Borgakh in the market square and stood in front of her and said, 11. She stood up from the wagon tongue. She was taller than him by that half head, and she looked down at him with her amber eyes full of something that was completely warm and entirely unhidden. 11, she said. It is done, he said. She reached out and took his face in both her enormous, careful hands and bent, and kissed him in the middle of the Thorngate market square, in front of the remaining crowd and the Ironvale delegation and Alderman Crow, who had the grace to look elsewhere and the good sense to tell the rest of the council to do the same. The crowd that was still there, not all of them looked away, and not all of the expressions of those who watched were welcoming, but enough of them were that Wesley felt the balance of the room tilt, and he thought it would tilt further over time. When she pulled back, her hand still curved around his jaw, she said, "You are remarkable." "I just talk to people," he said. "Most people cannot do that," she said. "Not honestly. Not you. You just walk up and tell them the true thing and they believe you because you believe it." Her thumbs traced along his cheekbones. "I knew it from the timber run. You do not know how to be anything except what you are." "You said that like it was a flaw when we first met," he said. "I was wrong," she said. He put his hands over hers where they held his face and said, "You are going to have to teach me Orcish." She made a sound that was entirely a laugh, surprised and full and real, and he thought it was the best sound he had ever heard in his life. "I will teach you Orcish," she said. "And I will teach you the border charter law," he said, "because clearly we are going to need it." "I will learn the law," she said, "if you will stop being afraid of the valley." "I was never afraid of the valley," he said. "I was afraid you did not actually want me there." The smile dropped slightly from her face and something very serious replaced it. She looked at him from an inch away with amber eyes that were completely clear. "I want you there," she said. "I want you everywhere. I want you for everything." She paused, and when she continued her voice was lower and more private, "Just for him. You are the first person who has ever made me feel like I did not have to be enormous to be safe. Like being here, just myself was enough." He leaned forward the extra inch and pressed his forehead against hers, the way she had done in the forest the night before the ceremony. "It is enough," he said. "You are everything." They stayed like that for a moment, foreheads together, hands tangled, the market moving around them. But there was still the matter of what came next. The question of where they would live was, as it turned out, not the largest immediate problem. The larger immediate problem arrived 5 days after the vote, in the form of 3 riders on the North Road flying Gareth's son's colors. Not his legal men this time, but something worse. Wesley had been in his timber camp when Borgakh arrived at a flat run, which she never did unless the situation required it, and the fact that she was running at all set his heart hammering before she had said a word. "Sund has hired hunters," she said without preamble, stopping in front of him with her iron blades already clear of their scabbards. "Not the magistrate, not the law, private hunters. Blades for coin. 3 of them with a 4th coordinating from Sun's eastern property. They have been told the binding ceremony is void, which is a lie Sun is apparently willing to pay well to sustain, and they are coming here to take me by force. She met his eyes. They are going to try to take me back across the border and present me to Sund as a hostile orc who crossed into settlement territory without a valid treaty, which also collapses the alliance. Wesley looked at her. When are they arriving? They are already in the forest, she said. A clan scout tracked them from the ridge. They split up on the north road, 2 coming around the eastern edge of the timber run, 1 coming straight down the road. He looked at his camp, lean-to, canvas awning. 1 horse currently at the picket line, 1 axe, 1 long knife he kept for camp work against 3 armed hired blades. We cannot fight 3 hired blades here, he said, not in the open camp. I know, she said, we need to run. The Thorngate Market, he said immediately. It is the closest place with witnesses and the charter's protection. In the market they cannot take you without a legal order, and Crow's vote makes clear there is no legal order. If we can get to the market they have no standing. 3 miles south, she said, through the timber runs. I know the timber runs better than they do, he said. We go through the eastern oak grove and then cut south through the creek bed. It is rough going, but it is fast and there is no clear line of sight. She looked at him. He looked at her. This was the moment that either worked or it did not, and they both knew it. Then we run, she said. He grabbed his coat, his long knife, and the horse's lead rope. She was already at the tree line. He cut the horse loose from the picket, not worth the time to saddle it in the open. And in the dense timber runs a horse was more hindrance than help, and slapped its flank to scatter it, and then he was running. They hit the eastern oak grove at a hard run, Borgakh moving through the trees with the fluid economy of a woman who had tracked boar through worse terrain for 3 days. Wesley knew every oak in this section by where their root lines crossed and how their branches spread, and he moved through them at a speed that surprised him, the familiar ground pulling him forward like a current. Behind them, maybe 200 yards back, he heard a shout, which meant the eastern pair had spotted the movement. They are behind us, he said, not stopping. I know, she said, keep moving. The creek bed was 30 yards wide and filled with gray stones and shallow water, and they went down the bank and into it at full speed, and the cold water came up to his knees and pulled at his boots, but they were through and up the other bank before he had time to think about it. Borgakh went up the clay bank like a cat, 1 leap, 1 hand to a root, and she was up, and then reached back and her hand came down and he grabbed it, and she hauled him up the bank in 1 pull as if he weighed nothing. They were moving again in the same heartbeat. The sound behind them was 2 sets now, thrashing through the oak grove with less care for speed than for aggression. The third, the one on the road, was the problem. If he had continued down the road while the other 2 pushed through the timber, he would be ahead of them, cutting them off from Thorngate. Wesley thought about the road layout, thought about the gap in the fence at the edge of the home farm, where Derek Holmes' stone wall had a section that had come down 2 winters ago and he had never fully repaired. You could cut through the farm, cross the south field, and hit the market road south of where the third man would be waiting. I know another way, he said. The home farm, there is a gap in the east wall. Lead, she said simply. He led. The home farm was 3 minutes further east than the direct southern route, and he spent a screaming internal second doing the math on whether the extra distance was worth the avoidance of the third man. And then they broke through the tree line, and he could see the farm's east wall ahead, and the gap exactly where he remembered it, and they went through it like water through a crack. Derek Holmes was in his south field with 2 farm hands, and he looked up at the sight of Wesley Dalton at a flat run with an orc woman right behind him and 3 shouted voices somewhere in the trees behind the wall, and his expression went through surprise and then quick comprehension. He was a smart man. He had voted for the alliance. South Gate, he shouted, pointing to the far end of the field. It opens onto the market road. Run. They ran. The market road met them at the south gate, and it was another 800 yards down the well-packed dirt into the market itself, and Wesley's lungs were burning, but his legs were steady, because 3 years of timber work had given him a foundation. And Borgakh was running beside him with her iron blade still in her hands and her braid coming loose from its rings, and her face absolutely set. They hit the Thorngate market at a flat run and went straight through the middle of it, scattering a row of canvas stalls and sending a startled goat running under a trestle table. And people turned and stared, and then the third hired blade appeared at the northern market entrance with a long hunting knife out, and his eyes locked on Borgakh. And then Alderman Crow stepped out of the contract office and took one look at the scene and said, at full volume, the voice he used for public address, "That man draws a blade in this market, and I will have him in the Thorngate lockup before dark. This market is under charter protection, and the treaty of the Ironvale Alliance is valid and voted, and any man who challenges it does so against the law of this settlement." The hired blade stopped. Behind Wesley and Borgakh, the two eastern hunters had broken out of the tree line south of the home farm and were approaching the market road, but they were slowing now, reading the crowd, reading Crow's stance, doing the same arithmetic that Harwick, Creel, and Bors had done in the street. The one where being publicly wrong in a crowd of witnesses was a worse outcome than backing down. The crowd, and there was a crowd, because this was the market day and 50 people were standing in various states of frozen astonishment watched. Borgakh turned to face the two approaching hunters from the road, blade still in hand, and she planted her feet and her whole body went to that particular state of readiness that spoke a language older than any charter or law, the language of, "I have not run this far to be taken, and you should think very carefully about what you do next." The three hired blades looked at each other, then at the crowd, then at Crow, then at Borgakh. They left not a word. Just the measured, purposeful walk of men deciding that this particular coin was not worth what was on the other side of it. Borgakh lowered her blades. She did not sheath them. She turned to look at Wesley, who was standing beside her with his long knife out and his chest heaving and the creek mud still on his boots. He met her eyes. She looked at him the way she had looked at him in the market square after the vote, but deeper. The way you look at someone when the danger is past and the relief is so large it becomes something else entirely. "You knew the farm," she said. "I know everyone in this settlement," he said. 3 years of selling them timber." She sheathed her blades. Then she put both her hands on his face the same way she had in the market square, but this time there was nothing public or performative about it. She cupped his face like it was the most important thing she was holding, and she looked at him with those amber eyes stripped down to nothing but the raw truth of what she felt. "You are the only person," she said, very quietly, "who has ever run beside me." He put his hands over hers. "I will always run beside you," he said. Borgakh made a sound in her throat that was not quite a word, something rougher and more elemental, and she pulled him in and held him there in the middle of the Thorngate market with both her arms around him, and his face against the warm curve of her neck, and the market crowd doing what it always did when confronted with something it did not know how to categorize, gradually, cautiously. With the particular pragmatism of people who have just watched someone with blades back down a trio of hired swords resuming its business. Crow came over, he looked at them, he said, "We should deal with Sund." "Yes," Wesley said from within Borgakh's arms. "Tomorrow," Crow said. "Tomorrow," Wesley agreed. Crow nodded and walked back to his contract office, and Wesley could hear in the man's footsteps the private decision to take the afternoon off. They dealt with Sund over the following week, and it was less exciting than the run through the timber but more satisfying. Crow petitioned the regional magistrate, the real one, not the local border adjudicator Sund had been working through, and filed a formal complaint of harassment and conspiracy against a charter-bound treaty. Wesley provided a written account of the hired blades that was co-signed by Derek Home and 2 other market witnesses. Borgakh provided a formal deposition from the Ironvale clan, which bore Urgamach's iron seal, attesting that the treaty and the binding ceremony were both valid, and that any further disruption would be treated by the clan as an act of hostile intent requiring a formal response. It took a week. Sun's formal challenge to the alliance was dismissed. Sund himself received a magistrate's warning that any further attempts to interfere with treaty negotiations or their participants would result in the revocation of his Eastern Land Charter. He did not try again. The question of where they would live was resolved in the most natural way possible, which was that they both simply decided, without a formal discussion, that neither of them was going to uproot entirely. Wesley would keep the timber camp as his working base. It was his livelihood, his contracts, his charcoal pits, and they would spend half the year in the Ironvale Valley, where Borgakh's position as warband second and the clan's iron trade required her presence. The camp itself changed. Not all at once, and not by design. It changed the way things change when a second person begins to inhabit a space, gradually and organically. Borgakh's second set of iron blades ended up on the workbench hook. A clan sleeping roll, broader and heavier than his, replaced his single canvas pallet. She had a habit of rearranging the firewood stacks from his rectangular piles into the angled cross stack that the Ironvale used, which burned more efficiently, and he switched to her method without comment because it was clearly better. She had a habit of sharpening things. Every evening, almost without thinking, she would pick up whatever blade was at hand, her iron knives, his axes, the camp hatchet, and take a whetstone to it while they sat by the fire. The sound of iron on stone became the background music of their evenings, and he found he loved it. He was learning Orcish. He was bad at it. The tonal qualities of the language were difficult, and he kept putting the emphasis in the wrong place, which meant he occasionally said things that were subtly but significantly different from what he intended, and Borgakh would correct him with the exact expressionless face she used when she was trying very hard not to laugh. One evening he attempted to say the phrase for "I am glad you came" and produced instead something that, as Borgakh explained with admirable composure, meant roughly "your goat is better than expected." She did not laugh. Her whole body shook with contained laughter, her shoulders moved, her jaw tightened. Her amber eyes went bright and crinkled at the corners. She held it for about 15 seconds and then she laughed out loud, real and full and unguarded, and he sat across the fire and watched her laugh and thought he had never been happier in his life. "Your goat is better than expected," he repeated solemnly. She covered her face with one enormous hand and the laugh came out again, higher this time, and he threw a small piece of pine bark in her direction. She caught it without looking. He loved her completely. He told her so, about 3 weeks after the run through the timber in the camp at night when the fire was low and they were lying under the heavy sleeping roll with the stars faint through the canvas gap above them. He said it quietly and simply, "I love you," not as a performance and not as a pressure, just as a fact he wanted her to have. She was quiet for a moment. Her arm was around him, which was often her preferred configuration. She liked to have him close in the dark. She had told him once, because the dark was the only time she let herself admit she liked the warmth of another person. He felt her breathe in slowly. "In Orcish," she said finally, "the phrase for love is not a feeling word, it is an action word. It translates closer to 'I choose you' ongoing, 'I keep choosing you.'" "Tell me the word," he said. She said it. He repeated it badly. She corrected him and he said it again closer. "Yes," she said, "like that." "I keep choosing you," he said in Orcish that was imperfect but sincere. She tightened her arm around him. She put her face against his hair. "I keep choosing you," she said back in his language, so he could understand every syllable without any ambiguity at all. The binding iron cord they had worn at the ceremony had been ceremonially removed after the first week, as both customs required. The orc rite said you wore it until the first sunrise after the binding was confirmed by both clans, and Urgamach had ridden down personally from the valley to confirm it on the morning of the 4th day, which was a gesture of formality that Wesley had understood to mean something significant. Borgakh had kept the cord, though. He had assumed she put it away somewhere. He found it one morning when he went to the workbench for the draw knife. It was looped around the nail where his camp hatchet hung, right next to her iron blades. There, in the center of the place where they worked and lived. He left it exactly where it was. 6 weeks after the binding ceremony, the northern winter began to come down out of the hills in earnest, and they packed the camp for the cold season and headed up to the Ironvale Valley, because the valley's stone longhouses were built for winter in ways his canvas and timber camp was not. He brought his axes and his draw knife and his charcoal accounts ledger, and she brought nothing she had not arrived with, because everything she owned was already integrated into the camp's daily life so naturally that the distinction had stopped being meaningful. The valley in winter was different from the valley in autumn, quieter on the surface, but busier underneath, the indoor work of winter preparation filling the long houses with noise and motion, and the smell of preserved food and worked iron. Wesley took on the timber work that the clan needed done during the cold months, seasoning logs for the spring building projects, splitting and stacking firewood, and found himself slotting into the valley's rhythm with an ease that surprised him. The clan regarded him with the cautious, assessing watchfulness of a community that was being asked to accept a stranger, which was fair, and he responded to it with the same straightforward consistency he brought to everything, showing up when there was work, eating when invited, learning the names and learning the work, not trying to be liked but simply trying to be useful and honest. The same things that had left him lonely at the Thorngate settlement edge worked differently in the valley, where directness was a virtue and usefulness was the primary social currency. Gretka, the woman who had been feeding the clan for 20 years, adopted him in the way that practical, tough older women sometimes adopted useful young men, not warmly, exactly, but decisively. She started leaving a second bowl whenever she saw him nearby at mealtimes, and corrected his orcish when she overheard it with a brisk efficiency that was actually more useful than Borgakh's corrections, because Gretka had no patience for charitable interpretation. The young warriors he had watched sparring on his first visit started including him in their post-practice cooldowns, which involved a great deal of sitting around a fire and arguing about technique in a mix of orcish and the trade tongue, and he found he had opinions about axe work that translated reasonably well into their discussions about spear handling if you squinted at the underlying mechanics. Borgakh Fireblood watched all of this from the careful distance he maintained from his daughter's domestic life, because he was wise enough to know that his daughter did not need his approval of her choices, and direct enough to know that this particular choice had been a good one, without requiring him to say so publicly more than once. But on a cold morning about 3 weeks into the winter stay, Wesley went out early for timber work and found the war chief already at the wood pile with his own axe, and they worked side by side in silence for half an hour before Borgakh said, in the trade tongue, "She sleeps without her blades in reach now." Wesley paused and looked at him. "She has always slept with a blade in reach," Borgakh continued. "Since she was 14 and the rival clan made a night raid, she has never unlearned it." He split a log with one clean blow. "She puts them on the workbench now when she sleeps." Wesley thought about Borgakh's blades on the workbench next to his axes every morning. He had thought it was just a habit, the same way she sharpened everything organizational. "I did not know that," he said. Borgakh glanced at him sideways. "Now you do," he said, and split another log. That evening, back in the long house they had been given for the winter, Wesley told Borgakh what her father had said. He told her without preamble, the way he did everything, because she deserved to know it, and because secrets between them felt wrong now, the way leaving a tool out in the rain felt wrong, wasteful of something good. She was sitting on the edge of the sleeping platform working on the lacing of one of her blade scabbards, and she went still when he told her. Her hand stopped on the leather. "He should not have told you that," she said, after a moment. "Why not?" he said. "Because it makes me sound," she paused, "softer than I want to be known as." He sat beside her on the sleeping platform. "Borgakh," he said. She looked at him. "Being safe with someone is not soft," he said. You are the most formidable person I know. You could take apart every problem this valley has thrown at me with one hand and have breakfast after. That does not change because you sleep without your blades in reach when you are with me." He paused. "It makes me feel," he searched for the right word and found it, "chosen. Like you chose me to be safe with." She looked at him for a long time with those amber eyes. The longhouse fire was burning low, and outside the wind was picking up in the winter hills, and the valley was pulling in around itself for the cold. "I did," she said. "I do." She set down the scabbard. "Every day." She reached up and took his face in her hands again, the way she always did, that gesture that was entirely hers, 2 hands, careful and warm and absolutely certain. "Your goat is better than expected," she said, very seriously. He laughed so hard he nearly fell off the sleeping platform, and she caught him with one arm without even adjusting her grip. And then she was laughing too, and the fire crackled, and outside the winter valley hummed with cold and life, and it was exactly where they were supposed to be. The winter passed well. The spring that followed it was the first spring of the new peace, which meant it was also the first spring trading season under the full terms of the Ironvale alliance. And the difference was palpable at the Thorngate market: more Ironvale iron coming south, more settlement timber going north, the cautious but functional neutrality of both sides beginning to warm incrementally towards something that might, in another few years, be called genuine coexistence. Wesley ran his timber contracts through the spring with Borgakh, spending half her time in the valley, coordinating the clan's trade arrangements, and half her time at the camp. And they moved between both worlds with the practiced ease of 2 people who had learned each other's rhythms completely. She knew when he was going to want quiet, and he knew when she needed to work out something physical, usually the wood pile, which was never going to go unsplit when she was around. There was a morning in late spring when he was loading a timber cart for the Thorngate delivery, and he looked up and saw her sitting on the fence at the edge of the timber run with her face turned up to the morning sun, her eyes closed, her iron blades at her hips and her braid over one shoulder, the charcoal leather warm in the early light. She was not doing anything, just sitting in the sun with her face turned up, still and unhurried and entirely at ease. He stood with a split pine in each hand and looked at her for a long moment, and the completeness of what he felt then was not something he had words for in any language. He thought Borgakh might have the right idea about it, the orc word for love, the action word. "I keep choosing you, not once at a ceremony, every morning. Every morning you woke up next to someone and chose to stay and keep building the life you were building together. That was the whole of it." He put the pine splits in the cart. She opened one amber eye and looked at him. "You are staring," she said. "I am," he said. "Why?" "Because I want to," he said. She turned her face back to the sun, and the corner of her mouth moved into the real smile, the one she kept locked up, the one that was only ever for him. "Carry on then," she said. He did. The formal resolution of the Gareth Sund situation came through the regional magistrate's office 8 months after the initial challenge, confirming the alliance and the binding ceremony as valid under all applicable charters and treaties, and ordering Sund's eastern land claim to be reviewed for violations of the original border compact. It was a document that said, in the careful language of magistrates and law clerks, what Wesley and Borgakh had already made true in practice. The agreement was real, the bond was unbreakable, and no amount of hired blades or legal maneuvering was going to undo what 2 people had built together from a bargain struck between strangers on a cold autumn morning in the timber runs. Crow brought the document to the camp personally, which was a gesture Wesley had not expected from him, and which meant more because of that. He stood in the timber camp with his good coat on and his hat off, and handed over the papers with an expression that in another man might have been an apology, and in Crow was the closest he could get to one. "Good result, Dalton," he said. "Yes," Wesley said. "It is." He showed Borgakh the document when she came up from the valley that evening. She read it with the careful focus she applied to any written material. She had been learning the Border Charter's written language over the winter, with the same direct application she brought to everything. She read it twice, folded it, and placed it on the workbench beside her iron blades and the binding cord. "It is over," she said. "It is done," he agreed. She turned and looked at him across the fire, and he looked back, and the Ashfall Forest was quiet around them, and the charcoal pit breathed its slow heat, and the pine trees stood in their enormous, indifferent patience. "I came to your timber run to find out if I could trust you," she said. "I remember," he said. "I found something I did not expect," she said. "So did I," he said. She crossed the fire and stood in front of him, and this time she did not take his face in her hands. She opened her arms, and he walked into them, and she wrapped him up in that complete, encompassing hold, her chin on top of his head, his face against the warm charcoal leather of her bodice, and the camp held them both like a cupped hand. "Home," she said, not to anyone in particular, just saying the word, testing it. Then, deciding, "Home." He put his arms around her waist and held on. "Home," he agreed. Outside, the spring evening was turning the Ashfall sky that deep, burning gold it only ever managed for about 20 minutes before sliding into purple dark, and the pine trees caught it and threw it back, and the camp smelled of charcoal and iron, and the particular clean cold scent of her that he had memorized in the first week and would know in any dark anywhere. The binding cord hung on its nail beside her blades. The document sat on the workbench, done and real and finished. He pulled back just enough to look up at her, and she looked down at him with those amber eyes, and what was in them was everything. The months and the miles and the run through the timber and the night in the pines and the real smile, and your goat is better than expected, and I keep choosing you. He kissed her, and she kissed him back, and the last of the golden light went out of the sky, and the stars came on, and the fire burned, and the Ashfall Forest stood its ancient watch around the small, luminous fact of two people who had started as a bargain and become a home.